Welcome back to another edition of the Quantum Yoga Podcast. We're here today with Dr. Shamini Jain, who's the founding director of the Consciousness and Healing Initiative. Thank you, Shamini, for coming on the program. So glad to have you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Happy to be here.
A good place to start, I think, would be your background and how you got interested in the work that you're in, and I'll let you introduce that so that I don't kind of chop it up in the wrong way. Yeah, please go ahead.
No problem. Well, I've been interested in the study of how science and spirituality meet because, as you know, there really is no distinction. I think at an early age, growing up as a person in an East Indian heritage and in the Jain tradition, I was always very curious by the books that I read and the way they would describe a number of different spiritual practices, including meditation and yoga, and their effects on the physiological system and the health system. And then as I, went through my schooling at Columbia University and in graduate school here in San Diego and University of Arizona, I started realizing that some of these areas, particularly those that kind of bumped up against the subtle energy aspects or the spiritual aspects, were difficult to study. And I'd say they were difficult to study, not necessarily because the subject matter is difficult, although it does present its own challenges. It was politically difficult to study these things because of these separations, these artificial separations that we have about being human and, having spiritual experiences and, whether those are okay to study using the scientific method. So, growing up, you can say, in academia, I was very aware of these distinctions and the difficulties that a number of my mentors and colleagues had in publishing their data in these areas of consciousness, particularly consciousness, exploring the roles of consciousness outside of the brain. I myself was very interested in studying the area of what we call now here in the science world biofield science, or the study of energy and information as it regulates our health. And so I've conducted clinical trials in these areas. So these are looking at modalities like healing touch and hands-on healing, and look to see whether those are actually effective in terms of treating patients who suffer from debilitating fatigue from cancer, for example, or patients who are suffering from PTSD and related symptoms. And my research area is in an area called psychoneuroimmunology, which I joke is just a very fancy term for, studying how the mind and body interact, essentially. But we use those tools as a way to explore how does healing and how does, our conscious process in facilitating healing in another, how does that play out in terms of not only our psychological well-being, but our physiological well-being as well? Is there a connection, and how do we use the tools in P&I, or psychoneuroimmunology, to really explore that connection between the spirit, consciousness, and health?
This is something that it's starting to emerge as a real how do I put this, is like a real thought form in the mainstream world. It's sort of like becoming accepted and really fascinating at the same time. And and I think it has to do, maybe it's just the world that I'm in here in Silicon Valley, but technology is driving this whole ability to measure and study everything. And so, I mean, if you're okay with it, let's jump right into technology. And if you can talk about how you did measure the effect of these various interventions. And is that the same technology you're using now? Or is there what's coming online in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is such a rich discussion, but I'll speak a little bit first about the clinical studies. So clinical studies are, of course, studies where we look at the effects of an intervention. In this case, the studies that I've done and several of my colleagues have done are in this area of biofield therapies or hands-on healing modalities, sometimes hands-off healing modalities. For patients. And so what we generally do is it's hard to really get at specific mechanisms. And quite honestly, I don't even like that word. Mechanism almost implies that there's a one pathway, which I don't think is actually true. But what we've done is we've looked at clinically relevant biomarkers. So things that I've looked at in the past have included cortisol variability, or the rhythm of cortisol throughout the day. A study that I did that was published in the journal Cancer actually explored the role of even placebo factors, and really asks the question, are these effects that we're seeing from hands-on healing modalities really due to what we're calling placebo effects? And that's a very rich discussion in and of itself. But this was a randomized controlled trial with 3 groups. And essentially what we found, and we measured everything, we didn't just have what they call a mock healing group, which is common, right? So we can discuss, the pros and cons of that design all day long. But what we also did is we asked the patients who were randomized to these different groups, what they thought they were getting, whether they thought they were getting healing, how connected they felt with the practitioner, how much they felt the treatment was helping them. Those are all aspects of what we call placebo, which is a misnomer in my view, that word. These are all aspects that we know can drive positive health effects. Well, basically what we found was that the energy healing group showed profound decreases in fatigue for fatigued breast cancer survivors. And this is a major issue in cancer. It is the most common complaint among cancer patients is fatigue, both during the process of having cancer and for many, about a third of patients afterwards, up to 10 years post-treatment. And it's significant. They can't do the things they used to do. They can't, exercise if they used to. They can't meditate if they used to. They just don't have the energy. And modern medicine has no gold standard treatment for this. These patients are essentially just given like SSRIs or something. They're given an antidepressant. And it's not often helpful for them to get that based on their reports to me. So what we found is, a very brief intervention of hands-on healing over a month, about 2 treatments a week, resulted in profound decreases in fatigue for these patients. With the mock group also showing some decreases, and we found a very specific effect for the hands-on healing group compared to both our mock group and waitlist control who were getting usual care. In cortisol variability, the rhythms of cortisol actually improved over the course of that 1 month if they were receiving the actual healing, and that was not due to placebo factors. So that's just one study, and I have other colleagues that have looked at healing touch and compared it with relaxation for cervical cancer patients undergoing chemoradiation. And they have also found improvements in natural killer cell cytotoxicity. So this is an immune measure that usually goes down when a patient's getting chemoradiation. In this case, for the women that were receiving healing touch, their natural killer cell cytotoxicity was actually maintained. And this was compared to both the patients in the relaxation group and the usual care group. So, on the clinical level, we're seeing some signal way downstream that's suggesting that there's something going on with these biofield interventions that appear to be affecting the physiology as well as the psychology. But the truth is, it's just like smatterings of evidence here and there because this area is so underfunded. It's still considered within the scientific and healthcare field so out there that, as promising as it is, because to me, these studies in biofield science are really pointing to the exploration of the real relationship of consciousness with health, in a much deeper way than just saying, here's how my brain changes. That's fun, that's great, but, there's a lot going on beyond that. These studies show so much promise, and we have these smatterings of evidence as far as the physiological effects, but there is so much more to do. Now, we were speaking about technology. I just wanted to kind of give you a bird's eye overview of how we've done some of these clinical studies. And just to summarize kind of where we are with the clinical data, here's what we know. Based on systematic reviews, which are basically, for those in the audience who may not be familiar with what a systematic review is, you're basically taking all the studies that have been published, you're evaluating the quality of those studies, how well were they conducted, how sample sizes, statistics, and you're compiling the data and looking overall to see what they've reported overall. What are the overall effects? So systematic reviews of biofield therapies in clinical populations report that they do appear to be pretty effective. That is, that there is strong evidence for the use of biofield therapies in decreasing pain in many different populations. There is promising evidence for them reducing behavioral symptoms in Alzheimer's disease. And there is some promising evidence in cancer and in other populations. So that's what we know kind of from the clinical evidence behind biofield therapies. And interestingly, one of my colleagues also did a systematic review that really looked at these therapies hands-off because, from a scientific point of view, some scientists will say, well, touch can be a co-founder. Sometimes people are touching, and we know touch has their own effects. So my colleague and research director, Richard Hammerschlag, did a systematic review where he looked only at biofield therapies that were hands-off the body. And he looked only at randomized controlled trials. And he also found that most of these studies showed an effect in the primary outcome that they were looking at, even with hands off the body. We have actually, this is kind of getting at technology, but in a different way. One of the things that we've done with the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, which is a nonprofit collaborative accelerator to forward the science and practice of healing, one of the things that we're really passionate about is translating this evidence to the general public. And so if you go on our website, which is www.chi.is, you'll see, you'll see there an infographic that we've developed. It's a dynamic infographic. So when you go to the website, you'll see a little thing there that says "Get Informed," and it says "Play with Data." When you go to that "Play with Data" space, you'll see that we've developed a dynamic infographic that actually shows you the level of evidence in a way that you can really dig in. So you can play with the data, you can sort it, you can look at the study quality, you can actually click. It's really fun. Yeah. And you can actually click, in those circles, and it'll take you straight to the paper. So you can really do a deep dive into the evidence. At the initiative, we feel like it's really important to share what we know, whether it's what healers have been, practicing for decades in their clinical practice, or whether it's the scientific evidence. People really need to understand where we're at with the science and practice of healing. It's so important. So this is, one of the things that we offer freely to folks that want to come onto our website and see what the evidence base really is.
Yeah, this is such an amazing infographic. I'm definitely going to put this in the show notes.
Yeah, okay. Fabulous. We'd love to share that. But going back to your question around technology, there is so much promise here with appropriate, what we would call healer-scientist partnerships in terms of technology development and disruptive technologies that could really help us solve major health problems. I really feel like that. So one example is diagnostics. There are many healers and medical intuitives that say they can get information from a person's biofield, their energy field. And they claim that many of them claim that they can see the energy fields around the body, and they can see where there's stagnations, they can see where there are issues, and that those can be related to health issues. Other healers and intuitives will say they get the information in different ways. They may feel the field, and they may be able to sense imbalances in the field that way. Now, what just quite honestly drives me absolutely crazy as a scientist is that there are virtually no published studies looking at this area of medical intuition. And it's insane because if what all of these healers from different traditions across, thousands of years, if what they're saying is true, and we can actually examine that in a scientific study, which there's no reason why we can't, right? It really opens the door to say, okay, first of all, can we train medical professionals on how to do this? There are people doing that, right? So can we train doctors on how to see and sense the energy field and detect disease before it manifests into the physical system? And can we develop technology? Because if we as human beings can see and sense this so-called energy, I mean, come on, you know this. Decades ago, the things that we thought we couldn't do with technology, we can now. Why couldn't we develop technology that reliably and accurately measures disturbances in the biofield and detect disease before it manifests in the physical system? Why couldn't we develop technology that people can use, that's user-friendly, so that they can actually, get a visual sense of where their energy field is and, use that to help them foster wellness? And of course, there are people that have been forwarding this area for decades. So Constantine Krokov is one. And when you had Tiffany Barsotti on your podcast, she likely talked about the BioWell.
Yeah, we interviewed Dr. Krokov as well.
Oh, great. So Constantine's a pioneer in this field. And his work is based on decades and decades of careful research and integration with different indigenous systems of medicine, including as I understand it, the Korean acupuncture system. So he integrates that in his algorithms. But this field, quite frankly, is just wide open and ripe for so much discovery and technology development. And we are actually actively working with healers right now in this area. Particularly in this area of medically related biofield diagnosis, if you will, to first of all really explore if there's any substance to the claim, because that's first, right? Okay, healers are saying this, but can we actually reliably examine this and see whether it holds true in some way? And then the second step is saying, okay, now, if different healers are all saying they're sensing a particular imbalance in the field, and we can kind of share, that there is strong inter-rater reliability there, that all these healers are feeling and sensing the same thing around a patient, then the next question is, what is that thing? And is that actually related to some sort of a clinical malady, some kind of clinical disorder? And then we start getting into, okay, how do we develop technology to actually sense what the healers are sensing? And I'll tell you, the healers that we're interacting with, they're all for this. They want this to scale. So they're coming to us and saying, I know we can develop technology that does what I do, and I want to help make that happen. So this is the power of the healer-scientist relationship. When we start doing studies where we don't just insert healer here or insert meditator here, right, which is historically what's happened in research, right? It's like the scientist has this great idea. They have their box of how they're doing things, which is based on, their valuable but limited knowledge as a scientist. And then they say, okay, I want to study meditation. So, you meditator, come here in the scanner and I'm going to measure your brain. Well, that's great. I mean, we've learned a lot. It's wonderful. But what would happen if we actually asked the meditator, what is really going on for you during the process of meditation? How does this help others? How does your presence as a meditator or a healer affect the healing of others? And we started asking those questions, and we started listening, and then we started developing studies that were really, based on this concept that I don't end here. I'm more than my skin. I'm more than my brain. I'm more than my body. So that's the kind of work that we are forwarding at the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, and it really takes a village. It takes it takes collaboration, and we're loving it.
It's amazing. I'm so happy to hear this and to learn about you guys, which I just recently learned about you guys, and so kudos to the work you're doing, Shamini. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a labor of love.
So getting back to your point on diagnostics, what are some of these diagnostic tools from a technology perspective that we do have?
Well, one, as you know, is the BioWell, which is based on biophoton emission. And Constantine has probably related that to you at this moment. So, I'm not going to go into detail on that because he's really the expert who developed it. We are actually exploring doing studies with the BioWell right now. It's been studied quite a bit in Europe, but it's barely been studied or published, in my view, in the U.S. in the way that it should be. So that's one technology that's out there that's being sold and being used by practitioners currently for diagnostic purposes. There's a lot more to explore. I think that the use of sound in general has been underutilized as a potential diagnostic tool. I know that there are some companies and groups that are interested even in looking at things like the human voice and exploring what can we tell about the different properties of phase, of resonance, of frequency, of amplitude that are reflected in the human voice, and can that tell us something about health status? So that's a fairly out of the box but yet achievable.
I've heard of this. Is the company Zyto? Or is Zyto is one, and there are others as well, I think, that are doing it. I don't know where all those companies are at with what they're doing, so I'm not going to name names at the moment, right. Because I don't know how public they are at right now. But there are people looking at that. We are exploring currently with a healer. I mentioned the first steps of the scientific study, but if we are able to reliably demonstrate reliability across healers in sensing things in the field, this particular healer who you've had on your show, Eileen McCusick, uses tuning forks.
as a method of getting information from the biofield of the body. And she has a whole theory of maps, of the biofield around the body and what they mean. So she has a desire, and we do as well, to explore this using sound, since she is using tuning forks. So I think sound is definitely an area that, again, the ancients have talked about forever. There's so much information in sound. So I think it's really a very ripe area for discovery. And I just want to say, we don't have all the answers yet. There's a lot of discussion about whether or not we can really explore all of the areas in the biofield using materialist methods. Okay, so, are we really going to be able to reduce everything that a healer, or a very enlightened being, say, can see, feel, or do with technology? We don't know. I mean, if you had asked me this question like 10 years ago, I would have definitely had a stronger opinion about it that was more negative. But as I see the way technology is developing, and I think what's exciting to me is, the brilliant minds that are in technology that are opening themselves up to these areas. The sky could be the limit, because, what is technology? It's just a way of us projecting, our kind of internal capacities in an external fashion. If you think about it,
Yeah.
there were all these predictions about we're going to be able to communicate, with others, across the globe. And some people thought that was telepathically, but now we have, cell phones and Skype. Does that mean that we can't communicate telepathically? No, it doesn't. But we're choosing to develop technology to do things outside of ourselves and use some kind of external agent. And, that's just because that's the way our cultural conditioning is at the moment. But as we evolve as human beings, it'll be really interesting to see how far we can take technology in terms of scaling healing. We just have to move away from this model of this disease model, the pathogenic model. Something's wrong with me. I have to figure out what this external agent is that's causing me pain and suffering, and I need to get rid of it. That's the pathogenic model. That's what drives medicine right now, right? That's shifting. So we're moving towards what we call a salutogenic model, a model of healing, a model of wholeness and being whole, and understanding that process is about being whole, not just within myself, but being whole, meaning being in balance with everything around me, with my environment, with my relationships, with my relationship to the earth. So as we move towards that model, our whole view of medicine is going to shift. It's already shifting. And our whole view of technology and how to use it is going to shift as well.
Yeah, I thought your explanation and your succinctness around explaining these two sort of polarities of the way that health is being looked at was very elegant in your TED Talk. And so I'd also like to place that up on the show notes for listeners to check out. What role, if any, do EEGs and EKGs play in measuring the biofield?
Great question, Jonathan. Thank you. So a lot of people don't think of electrophysiology, EKGs, EEGs, even skin conductance as biofield measures. But in fact, they are. They are measuring the aspects of what we call the veritable aspects of the biofield, the things that are easily measured, which now we know give us very important prognostic and diagnostic information, right? So those are biofield measures. And James Oshman, who may be another guest that you'd like to have on your show, he's wonderful, and he's a pioneer in the field of energy medicine research and biofield research. He's written about this extensively in his book, Energy Medicine, The Scientific Basis. And he describes how these measures of EKG and EEG were essentially the first biofield measures that are out there. And we can use these measures to explore interesting relationships with consciousness. So I'll just share with you one of the projects that our scientists at the Consciousness and Healing Initiative are engaged in now. And, because we're a collaborative accelerator, when I talk about CHI, or the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, it's not just a standalone institute. It's actually an accelerator that brings together different scientists that are in different places. So this particular project, called The Power of We, involves scientists from IONS. It involves scientists at UCSD and in other places. And what we're doing is we're actually applying these electrophysiological tools to look at synchrony across people in group context, where we're trying to scale healing by doing group collective meditations, group intention meditations. And so we're applying these tools of EEG and EKG to really more deeply look at not just what does meditation do for me in my brain and in my body, but what does it do for us? Is there a synchronization, a meaningful synchronization that occurs between people when we meditate together? And how might that be related to different kinds of outcomes, all the way to the societal level? So there are other colleagues of mine that have looked at EEG in what is called Shaktipat, or the transmission between an adept meditator, healer, and a receiver. So you can use EEG in that way. My colleagues at IONS have looked at EEG in the context of mediumship. That is people who claim that they have a very strong and direct connection with what we call a non-embodied being, right, a spirit. And they look to see whether there's reliable shifts in the EEG signal when they're connecting in that way versus when they're not connecting. So we can use these biofield tools to explore these interesting areas of consciousness.
And are people using, how often is skin conductance used in this at all? It's not something that I hear very much about, but it kind of goes hand in hand. If you're going to start measuring the electromagnetic field of the body, this is just another representation of that.
In the current time, I'd say it's underutilized, but it was looked at in the early days. So, the Valerie Hunt at UCLA did some seminal work, looking at different surface electrodes, including electromyogram as well, in the context of a Rolfing study. And, she reported on different frequencies that were related to the perception of different chakra energies with a healer and medical intuitive Rosalind Bruyere. Marilyn Schlitz and Dean Radin, I think, early on, several decades ago, looked at skin conductance as a measure of whether someone could influence another person's physiology from afar. Skin conductance, I think, while it can be kind of a messy measure because it's influenced by sweating and things like that, right? It can be a nice pure measure of sympathetic nervous system activation, and certainly there are other ways to measure sympathetic nervous system activation. But I think that in general, with our fascination with the brain, sometimes we've forgotten about the body, and the more that we're really applying whole systems type of measurement, meaning, we're really rigorously looking at parasympathetic nervous system function, sympathetic nervous system function, brain measures, and brain-heart correlation measures, really starting to look more again in a more integrative fashion, the more interesting our data is going to be and the more meaningful it's going to be. But, overall, not a ton of people at this moment are looking at skin conductance in biofield science. But, there's only a handful of us right now doing this research. If we're successful at the initiative in really in fostering some groundbreaking research in this area, my prediction is, within 10 years, a lot of people are going to be doing research in this area.
And the reason I bring it up is that, so I've been exploring muscle testing, which my left brain is like, what? I just cannot get my head around this. And well, that's the point, right? Is not to really be in the way of it, but it seems, it's often compared to polygraph, right? And so you're kind of basically measuring the autonomic nervous system in a way through its signal that it's being sent to. What is your opinion on this?
Ian, muscle testing is really interesting, and it's been around for quite a while. I do know practitioners that use it often in their practice, and I can't say I understand it completely, except with the basic premise that the body doesn't lie, and so in that way, it's not that different from a number of different biofield healers that are looking at energy and information around the biofields of the body. Right? This is looking at the biofield in the body. People sometimes forget the biofield isn't just like this aura that's outside of the body only, right? It exists within the body as well. And, exploring, again, I'll be honest, I haven't looked to the literature to see how many studies are actually out there with applied kinesiology. Certainly there should be, if they're not. And it is related to biofield science, I would say, because it's, it's about whether or not the body is holding specific memories or giving you information that's valuable to your health. That premise is not such an out there premise. I mean, from an indigenous medicine point of view, from the, a systems medicine point of view, it makes sense that the body would hold information. How accurate applied kinesiology is, how well it's reliable, across different practitioners, do they all get the same information or whatever? I don't know what the studies say on that. I don't know if there are studies that say it, but it would definitely be worth exploring if there aren't. And, whether you could look at that with EMG would be very, very interesting, because then you'd have a so-called, objective measure of it as well.
And how, in sort of going along this line, are you guys exploring or working with or researching heart rate variability and this field?
Absolutely. Heart rate variability has been a very hot measure for, the last decade, as we've learned more about its relevance to clinical outcomes. And, the fact that it supposedly gives you some information about the sympathetic nervous system as well as the parasympathetic, although there is some debate about that, and it all depends on how you're looking at it and things. But people are using heart rate variability in their assessments of biofield. I want to actually point out a really fun study, because we're humans and we're human focused and we're always thinking about humans in our studies. But a colleague of mine who is an active biofield researcher, Ann Baldwin, who's at the University of Arizona, recently published some very interesting heart rate variability data with equine therapy with horses, looking at the entrainment of people with horses. From a heart rate variability context. And that was very interesting. And as I mentioned in our Power of We study, we're looking at heart rate variability, and we're very interested in heart rate variability or heart rate entrainment. I mean, the truth is we don't know yet what we're going to see, and we have to look at this very carefully. We don't know if we see any synchronization in heart rate variability, what aspects of heart rate variability? Is it going to be driven by respiration? Is it going to be driven by breathing? Basically, are people going to be breathing together and that's what's driving it? But it's an interesting area to explore for sure. And people are looking at it in the context of biofield research. And, in behavioral medicine research and integrative medicine research, it's a very hot measure.
Let's explore this concept of placebo, which you mentioned before as something that you're just kind of like, we need to upgrade this term, basically. Totally
need to upgrade it. Yeah, thank you. I love talking about this because I think it's so important. Even one of the things that I came away with that TEDx talk was I had people come up to me later. As a scientist and as a clinical psychologist, I sometimes forget how so much of what we know as psychologists and scientists isn't always translated to the general public. So I had people coming up to me after that TED Talk and saying, I never thought of placebo that way. I never thought it meant, that I could heal myself. And I'm like, well, yeah, because of the way that we talk about placebo. And, I mentioned this in the TED Talk. There was like this Newsweek article that said how antidepressants don't work. And the real title should have been, how placebo is showing us that we can heal our own depression. We may not need antidepressants to heal ourselves from depression. That was actually the message. So what is placebo? It's a very rich catch-all phrase for different things that we know go on within us and between us. So what is that? I'm going to just break it down for people who aren't super familiar with this concept of placebo. Here's what we know scientifically about the placebo effect. It's nuanced. It includes things called expectation, which means how much am I expecting that this treatment, whatever I'm engaged in, is going to help me. Okay, we go down a layer from that and we look at conditioning. Conditioning is related to expectation, but it's a little different. It's kind of like, okay, I have been going to this Reiki healer for, 6 months and I've noticed improvements. And, I'm going to go to them again. It's been a couple of months, but my body-mind kind of knows what's going to happen. And so my body-mind kind of gets into a particular state, maybe even before I get there. And certainly when I'm there, I'm almost conditioned to the effects, of Reiki, for example. So just to give kind of a flavor of what conditioning means. But beyond expectation and conditioning, there's also meaning and context effects, which some have argued are really the thrust of what placebo effects are. So what is meaning and context? Well, first of all, what does my illness mean to me? What does healing mean to me? What is this therapeutic environment that I'm in, the room that I'm in, the music that's playing, the surroundings? That all matters. What about my relationship with the healer. That matters significantly. We've had a number of studies now that have looked at how the therapeutic relationship affects outcomes. That's part of what we call placebo. So placebo is like this umbrella term for all of these different aspects of personal and people-to-people responses. So what is that? I mean, that's actually consciousness in action, right? So I call placebo, I say it should be reframed as heal. My scientist colleagues won't like this because it's stretching a little bit. But I call heal holistic elements that activate life force. So my colleagues will take issue with this life force term, right? Because it's not well accepted yet in science. You could call it, holistic elements that activate salutogenesis, but that's not as fun to say as heal. But what it is it's all consciousness, right? So what does this mean? What we know about placebo is your consciousness matters, both as a recipient and as a deliverer, okay? As a clinician, how deeply I'm able to step into consciousness and facilitate a healing response matters. That's part of what feeds the therapeutic relationship. How much do I believe as a clinician that this therapy that I'm delivering or recommending is going to help? We already know that has outcomes. That's consciousness. How much does my presence affect the healing of another person? That's consciousness. And then, so it's almost like you're going from sort of I don't like the word subconscious and conscious that much, but you can use these terms in this way. So sort of sub-threshold consciousness, if you will, sort of that primordial consciousness, which is related to presence, filtering up all the way to, waking consciousness of expectation. Placebo is really how consciousness is affecting the healing process. All the way from the depths of consciousness to the waking aspects of consciousness. So if we start exploring placebo in that way, it's such a rich area, and it's actually lends itself much more clearly to understanding the role of consciousness in the healing process versus I'm taking a dummy pill, and so now my drugs don't work, and so everything is lost and hopeless. Because that's actually not the truth. It's not really the message. So we really need to reframe the way that we're looking at placebo. And that also means in science, we've got to get away from this idea that we have to prove that our therapy, our meditation, our yoga, our biofield, our acupuncture is better than placebo. Because the question actually makes no sense. Placebo is sort of the foundational aspects of good medicine, in a way. And then these modalities that we put on top of them are, what we can call effects that may be augmenting, in a sense, placebo effects. So it's really probably an interactive process versus an additive process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned in this Harvard study that you referenced that something like 75% of the placebo actually heal themselves. And it was something like 25% that were taking an SSRI where there was a significant change. And so then
I can help break that down a little bit. Just to clarify that, this was based on meta-analyses that Irving Kirsch and other colleagues have done at Harvard. They've done several, actually, both looking at published studies and studies from the FDA that were not published. And essentially what they found when they did their meta-analyses is they were interested how much of the changes in depression were actually due to, most likely due to the physical chemical attributes of the drug versus other things. And so what they found was about 50% of that would be 50% of the positive effects, the improvements of depression, were more due to what we call placebo factors, these things that I just mentioned, meaning context, expectation, conditioning, and 25% due to what we might call natural history effects. So combined, 75% of the effects of what we are calling antidepressants on depression aren't really due to the drug. They're due to all these other factors, these consciousness-based factors, if you want to say that, and history factors. And about 25% of those effects were actually due to the drug itself. Now, my guess is it may be similar for other modalities as well. There's a lively debate going on around acupuncture and how best to study it and how much is placebo and things like that. We have these, discussions in every form of medicine. But again, really points to why are we looking just at these, what we call these specific modalities and not looking at the core of the healing process itself?
Well, it leads to one of the other topics I wanted to cover with you is consciousness itself. And I wonder, I'm just throwing this out here, if you can kind of create an anatomy model for us of consciousness, because usually,
Sorry, I just have to laugh.
usually you hear conscious, subconscious, and maybe superconscious or
Yeah.
supraconscious, right? As these kind of three layers of maybe like this is us awake and aware, normal consciousness, and then there's this like iceberg underneath us, right? Of the 95% that is like all this like powerful stuff, and then we have this high self, if you will, that is
Mm-hmm.
another aspect. So, how do you see it? Can you?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's so many models. The reason I was giggling is because there's so many models, and so having a definitive model, I laugh at that because it's all, it's kind of based on our own experience and our belief systems and all of that. I can share with you, this might be helpful, I can share with you what I've learned from, the Jan tradition, and which stems very back deep into Vedantic roots and things like that. And I'll also share with you, this is kind of fun. One of my first conversations with Deepak Chopra. So I met him for the first time several years ago when we were fundraising for our Biofield Science and Healing meeting, which was done in 2014 with help from the Chopra Foundation, Institute of Noetic Sciences, Miraglow Foundation, and other groups. And I was sitting with him and just explaining why I thought this area of biofield science was so fascinating and important and all of that. And we sat for a while, and he said, yeah, Shamini, it's fine. This is an important area of study, but in the end, it's all consciousness. It's all consciousness. And he had a particular view at the time of biofield work, which I see often as people sometimes put the Reiki and things like that into this pathogenic model where it's like, oh, you have an ache and a pain, let me do Reiki on it and it'll go away. That's not really what it's about, but a lot of people view it in that way. It is very much a consciousness-based approach. So from the Vedantic point of view, consciousness is the form, is the source and substrate of all experience, right? Everything essentially is consciousness. Everything stems from consciousness. From the Jan point of view, they talk about consciousness as being one of the fundamental aspects of what we call the soul. Okay? So the soul is essentially made up of consciousness, and consciousness is manifestation. And then they describe the different bodies from there. So these bodies that you're talking about, the different conceptions of the self, the subtle levels, the physical, gross physical levels, what some people call the emotional body, the mental body, these other bodies that are described in Vedanta, they're almost seen as like these layers going from the least subtle, going from the most subtle, which would be consciousness itself, which from the Vedantic, point of view, as I understand it, certainly from the Jan point of view, is completely subtle. It's not physical at all, right? And so then you sort of start layering out. And this is a deeper discussion, which I don't think I can do in 5 minutes. We have written some papers on this. This is actually available on our website as part of our special issue. We explored Tibetan, Jan, and Vedantic points of view on consciousness in the biofield, and that paper is readily available through our website. You just sign up as a subscriber, essentially, which is free, and you'll get links to all these awesome papers, and this is one of them. As consciousness moves into more and more of the physical realm, right? You get the energy bodies, the different forms of the energy bodies, the mental bodies. These bodies interact with consciousness to produce results like emotions, mental formations, things like that. And karma has a huge role to play in this. So it's complex. I wish I were skilled enough to describe it very well in 5 minutes. But I'm not there yet to give a comprehensive model of consciousness. I wish I could.
Well, so it leads me to another thought that I've just been kind of noodling around over the past couple of months is which aspects of the biofield do we think are non-local? Are there any? And now we're starting to get into these subtler layers, if you will, in that sort of at the very, very beginning, if you will, the seed of it all, to where it starts to condense to the point where, okay, now you have a measurable magnetic field that is some feet away. And at what point At what point is the biofield this sort of encapsulated sphere around a person, and what point is it just continue to go and connect
Such a
to
great question.
everything
Yeah.
else?
It's such a great question, and scientifically, I will tell you that where we've decided at this point in time is that we can't start really with any sources, with any substance. We can't start discussing big B, all-encompassing biofield until we have a handle a little bit more on what we call the little b biofields, because this area is so nascent. There's so much to look at from a scientific point of view, and yet the data suggests that there is a non-local aspect to what we're calling biofield in terms of the studies that have been done with distant healing, distant intentionality, and others, that it is likely not just based on inverse square laws. Now, but there's some data suggesting in the context of healing that things can follow an inverse square law. So there's a study looking at the effects of healing on calcium flux in a cellular model that shows that the data follow an inverse square law. That is, the further away the healer was from the cells, the less strong the effects are. That's one study. Okay, and then there are these other studies that are looking at healing and consciousness-based effects on affecting physiology from a distance. So likely, there are non-local and local effects all the time, right? And the tricky thing from a scientific point of view is coming up with a real unified model that can integrate local and non-local effects well, and we'll learn more in the next 10 years. Quantum biology in macroscopic systems is just starting to emerge, as a real field of study with some promising data. So, if we can really effectively look at entanglement in physiological systems, as we begin to look at that, more deeply, and as, we have the tools to be able to look at that, we'll have a better answer to that question, how important are local effects, non-local effects? How reliably can we measure those? And, from my point of view as a clinician, how much do they matter? How much do they matter? I mean, from a science point of view, there's no end to it. There's so much fun stuff to explore. But I'm a pragmatist, so I think, as a healer, what do I need to know? What do I need to teach others in terms of how they can augment their capacities to heal others?
So there is an aspect of the biofield that is non-local.
Yes.
Okay. Got it. Well, I had a really interesting conversation with Roland McCready a little while ago, and he was talking about these magnetometers that they have set up all over the planet now, and this theory that basically all of our heart fields are connected to the Earth's magnetic field, and that this is, which you are well aware of. Yeah. This really kind of that blew my mind. Can you speak at all to this? Are you?
Yeah, Roland's really more of the expert because they've been doing that work with the Global Coherence Project for a while now, and we've discussed with them opportunities for exploration. We were actually interested in looking at the effects of solar storms on human behavior, because there is some anecdotal evidence that suggests that solar storms may even affect trading activity. But we don't really understand why or how. So there's a lot to explore there, and we've discussed this with Roland. So there's there's also the Global Coherence Project, which is a project that is not using magnetometers, but using this is a project that has been in collaboration with the Princeton group, the Princeton Engineering for Anomalies Research Group, for many years, where they're using random number generators. And, they have those kind of also placed across the globe. And what's interesting, kind of almost in my mind relates back to our discussions of skin conductance and sympathetic nervous system arousal. One of the consistent findings that they have found with this RNG data is that when there are major catastrophic events, there is a deviation from normality in these RNGs. And, I don't know if we want to get into what the RNG measures and what it does, but essentially it's measuring deviations from randomness. Let's just call it that to make it simple. What they have found is when there are major earthquakes, when there are other major catastrophic events, these RNGs kind of synchronize in some weird way and show these deviations from normality and their correlations across them. So it's almost like there is this world gasp, if you will, that's being picked up by by these machines.
In
There's
advance of an event, right?
Yeah, and it's very strong energy. I mean, if you want to just sort of put it in layman's terms, right? It's strong energy. So I'm interested in exploring, what happens when we foster strong energy that isn't caused by panic and anger and anxiety. What happens then? How do we affect the world when we strengthen our abilities to love and send healing, in a deep and powerful way? What happens then? And how do we measure that?
Switching gears a little bit, I'm interested to know about any research you're aware of or have done into light frequencies and their effects on the biofield.
We have not, in the initiative, done a ton with that. Obviously, biophoton research is a huge part of that. Beverly Rubik, actually, who was on your podcast and is part of our scientific advisory council for Qi, recently published a paper looking at healing and biophoton emission, which is out there for people to read. So biophoton emission is where most of us have gone. But I know that there is a group, I think they're called International Light Association, that is very interested in looking at light in many different ways, both as a measure and, as an intervention. So, there definitely are people doing research in light. There are definitely healers and scientists that, think that really what we're measuring essentially is light, that the core of consciousness is light. Some people will say that. So, we talked about opportunities for technology development. Obviously, sound is one and light is another. And a lot of fun things being done in that space right now.
And talk to us, if you can, at all about the mitochondria. And
oh my God, this is amazing! You're asking this. Tell me why you're asking. This is great.
Well, it's been an area that I've been really interested in before I got into biofield science study, and as I learn more about it, everybody wants to talk about ATP. But I just find that there are so many other interesting things about the mitochondria that especially correlate with the biofield. Mm-hmm. So what can you tell us about?
You might be educating me on this, Jonathan. This is an area that I'm just starting to look more deeply into. I will tell you that a number of us have been interested in studying mitochondrial function and mitochondrial regulation in the context of healing, because intuitively, it makes some sense. Data-wise, there's not much out there at all. But, knowing what we know about biophoton emission, its relationship to ROS, or reactive oxygen species, the reports of increased energy and decreased fatigue, in patients that are receiving these kinds of consciousness-based approaches, energy approaches, it would make good sense to look at it. We're actually just gearing up right now, hopefully, crossing fingers, to do a study looking at a biofield therapy in heart failure. And I'm interested, the data is pretty nascent at this point, but it would be very interesting to look at microRNA changes in the context of mitochondrial regulation in heart failure. So, how do we best look at it is a question. In which context, it depends on the clinical population. There's so many aspects of mitochondrial function to look at. So whether you're looking at something that's much more downstream, or whether you're wanting to look at epigenetic regulation of mitochondria in a clinical context, it's an area that's very ripe for discovery. And, let me be perfectly honest with you. If we had funds to support this kind of research, we would be, being able to scale our findings in the healthcare sector and the technology sector so much more. But, you and I are talking here, and we have some familiarity with this area and with the research, but most people don't. And it's still considered very, very fringe. So when I go to the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, which are the typical funding agencies for scientists who are studying these areas, or even the DoD, the Department of Defense, and we say, we want to study these things, most of them think we're nuts. I mean, that's the truth. That's kind of where we are. And these studies cost money. I mean, to look at mitochondrial function is not a small thing, in terms of clinical studies. So, part of our charge as, with the initiative is being able to source that support to do these groundbreaking studies in healing in a sensible way so that we can really scale. So that we can really scale what we know, and that we can really implement this into healthcare in a deep way. So these kinds of groundbreaking studies that you're talking about, looking at mitochondrial function and looking at it in a very deep and careful way, are absolutely crucial to us forwarding the field. But we do need the support to be able to do that, at this juncture. It's about a 10-year plan for sustainability for the research in biofield science. The good news is we've got incredible scientists that are well placed at major universities across the country and in some parts of the world, including Europe, that are absolutely ready to do this research, that want to do it, but they can't get funding support from the NIH. They can get funding support for their mainstream work, no problem, and they do. They're well seasoned investigators, but we need to help them. We need to help them do this work.
Well, if you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us, now's a good time. We're kind of rounding the bend here towards the end of the conversation. Anything that we haven't covered that you would like to mention?
Yeah, I would just like to invite folks to join our community to get informed on the things that we're doing and the information that we share. We have information from healers, kind of practice-related things, and we share the science as well. A very wonderful, lively group of contributors. So I invite folks to go to our initiative website, which is easy to remember. It's www.chi or chi.is. Chi.is. And feel free to join our community and explore and contribute.
Thank you so much, Shamini. Before I let you go, what would you say if you had to throw 3 to 5? What would you say would be the 3 to 5 top biofield health practices a person could incorporate into their life?
The first is grounding. And we actually have a lovely video on this on both our Facebook page and our website with Reverend Rosalind Bruyere, who is a grandmother of healing, basically. Where we talk about grounding and its importance, but it's very simple. We could even just stick with this as a practice because in this day and age, grounding is the most important thing that we can do. So from a biofield point of view, this is feeling your feet on the ground, going all the way to the toes, which for some of us heady people is not easy to do, but so important. Connecting with the earth deeply and feeling that nurturance and that energy that comes from the earth that supports us, and we can support it as well. So really fostering that deep connection with the earth, just placing our feet on the ground. You can do this anywhere. You can do this in your office chair. If you have, the possibilities of going barefoot on the earth, on the sand, in the woods, great. But you don't even have to. You can do it with your shoes on. But grounding is absolutely important. Breathing in harmony with the earth and allowing the biofield of the earth to support you and you to support it, so that we're really fundamentally interconnected on that level. That's number one.